Right. Hello and welcome everyone to the City Futures Research Centre seminar series. My name is Dr. Sophie May Kerr and I'm a research fellow at the centre. I would like to acknowledge as we hold this seminar online that we meet on Aboriginal land. I acknowledge the traditional custodians of Dharawal country whose lands I'm joining you from today. I pay my respects to elders past and present as well as to First Nations people joining us today. And I invite you to use the chat function to share the country that you're joining from. We ask that you please mute your microphone and turn off your camera during the presentation. Once we get to the Q&A, you're welcome to turn your cameras back on. We will monitor the chat for questions, and you can also use the raise hand function during the Q&A to ask questions. Today, we are delighted to welcome Dr. Charlie Gillon, a research fellow and early career academic at the City Futures Research Centre. He is an urban geographer with a specialisation in housing research. Charlie's research agenda is focused on the people and politics of suburban redevelopment. He's currently working on an ARC discovery project, AI, Cities and Development Assessment, developing trustworthy support tools. And today, Charlie will present an update from this project with his presentation titled Investigating the Early Adoption of AI-Powered Tools for Development Assessment in Australia. So over to you, Charlie.
Great. Thank you, Sophie. May just checking you can still hear me okay?
Yes, all good.
Excellent. All right. Well, thanks all for joining me online. I'd just like to acknowledge that I'm talking to you from Dharawal today in Wollongong, where I live and work from home. And I'd like to pay my respects as well to elders past, present and emerging and extend that respect to any First Nations folks on the call today. As Sophie May introduced, I'm really excited to present on the ends of the first year of an ARC discovery project that we were fortunate enough to receive at the end of 2024 at UNSW in the School of Built Environment and at City Futures, focusing on something that's quite topical and something that's also really at the forefront of the planning profession, but also, I suppose, something that's happening on a global scale to all professions and livelihoods. The introduction of AI and what it means for processes, for people, for places. So today I'm going to share some of the project to date and really focus on what we've done, what we've set up, the project itself, and some of the early reporting on interviews that we've done thus far among development assessment interest groups, and I'll go into that in further detail. So just a quick agenda for today. Firstly, an introduction to the project. Secondly, unpacking what we mean by trust, in trust in planning, trust in AI, but also trust at that interface between planning and AI. Thirdly, just a bit of a stock take, what AI looks like for development assessment in early 2026 in Australia as we see it. I know folks online will also have perspectives on that and maybe using it in their roles. And yeah, we're very interested to hear about that in the discussion. And then some key takeaways to set up the discussion and thinking about what's next for the project, given that it's a 3-year project and we're just approaching the end of the first year.
Speaking.
Oh. Okay, so to introduce the project. So starting, I guess, with the why for the project, and the why for AI is a great place to start. So if we think about a funnel and all these factors coming into place, let's start with the housing supply crisis. It is not far from the front page around Australia, around the world. It set the scene in Australia for the National Housing Accord, 1.2 million new homes to be delivered over 5 years, and New South Wales tasked with delivering close to 30% of that, 377,000 of these. Within that housing supply crisis is concerns about affordability, about intergenerational equity, but that point around supply is really critical to shaping the way that AI has been introduced into this problem. So planning, the planning process of land use planning has been a long-term target of blame for issues with housing supply and affordability, where planning is perceived as red tape, slowing down approvals and development. Development outcomes on the ground are, of course, far more complicated than this. It does not begin and end with planners and the planning process and the approval process. There are a lot of other factors at play, but planners are at the forefront of that blame. for various reasons that we can discuss. Third is operational constraints. There are planner shortages, which have been noted not only in Australia by PIA and other organizations in their most recent State of the Profession report, but also internationally. There is I suppose, a bit of a brain drain around planning. Folks that are very experienced approaching the end of their careers, but also at the other end, the early career cycle for planning. What does that look like? What does the future of that look like is something that is really key here. And there are limits to those capacities. So resourcing constraints in local government, which are, they play a role in this process, and there's a lot to be said for, I guess, the responsibilities put on local government and the capacities that they have to deliver on those responsibilities. And then lastly, of course, is AI. So since November's 2022 release of ChatGPT, the availability of this AI technology, tools such as ChatGPT, Copilot, and other things that are bolted onto software packages that we already have and we're already familiar with, the promise and potential of that, the hype surrounded by artificial intelligence and AI, particularly in the form of chatbots and large language models, the financial investment that's happening at scale, the level of investment, the likes of which we've not seen for a very long time. If we think about resources and economies, to the point that we're starting to think, is this an AI bubble? Is it going to pop? Just the scale of investment and that return on investment, which is something that we're all, I guess, part of seeing in the way that AI is being adopted. And as that investment happens, the capability increases. So the hype, the promise, and the potential are, at a peak level. Gartner's often cited hype cycle. AI is at the peak of inflated expectations. We've gone past that initial moment of inception, that there's adoption, and we're at that point now where we're starting to really think about what this actually looks like on the ground. And it's something that we're really interested in, and we're lucky enough to have 3 years to think about it. So I guess a useful way to contextualize the project, but also to reflect the burning platform that this has, that AI has for its introduction into the planning process and the political will that sits behind that. This is a quote from Minister Scully at New South Wales Planning's announcement of AI and planning initiatives in February 2024, which I think captures the sentiment pretty well. That introducing AI into our planning system is about working smarter so that councils can assess DAs faster, which helps them to build more homes where they needed most. It will help us cut down DA assessment times, saving proponents, councils, developers, and taxpayers valuable time. So the focus here, really a focus on productivity, efficiency, effectiveness, that AI is able to speed up a process which in some corners is seen as too slow, is viewed as red tape, and also practically thinking about those constraints on planners and shortages around what planners are able to do with the time that they've got and how to best use those resources, both of time and of personnel. So I guess this really reflects the burning platform that contextualize us putting in a discovery project. So just to briefly introduce the project, we are just about a year into this project now. And the key objective of this project is looking conceptually at trust and trust in AI for the purposes of supporting development assessment tasks and functions. The idea behind this is academic, in that we're really interested in this idea of trust and what it means. And the team is made up of folks from City Futures and the School of Built Environment. We've got social scientists, critical urban studies researchers, planners, and urban analytics researchers. So all coming together, intersecting that knowledge to think about what real on-the-ground adoption of AI in development assessment is looking like. Thinking about some of, and I'll speak on this a little bit later, but I suppose, associations with technology adoption in the planning profession is that there is a sense of slow adoption for new technology and new system changes. So we're really interested in thinking about that idea of trust. How does trust play a role in adoption, and how can we get the best out of this technology, which has purported benefits, and we're starting to see some of those benefits demonstrated across the industries and sectors that are affected by this. So the way that we pitched the project was case study research in Australia and overseas, looking at three focus areas. Firstly, current AI implementation and use in city planning and related industries. Secondly, looking at reforms in planning, particularly those that are enabled by technology to development assessment processes, and thinking about what can we learn from past reforms, what should we be thinking about current reforms, not only in state-based planning systems in Australia, but also around the world. What are other places doing and what can we learn from those places? And then lastly, thinking about the future. And in the last year of the project, we're really wanting to do some futuring work with key actor groups in the DA process. So what do we need to have a trustworthy implementation of AI? What are the critical components of that, and how can we bring that forward with everyone who's involved? So I guess to narrow down a little bit further what we mean by case study research, it's involving interviews and workshops with key actor groups in the development assessment process. And we're defining key actor groups as those who are acting in that process, which includes land use planners, so at local government level, property owners, and that can be at different scales, includes small scale landholders, but also large land and property developers. It includes the planning intermediaries that assist property owners to become applicants in a process, which includes private planning consultants and other development professionals, such as architects, engineers, government agencies, both as policymakers and referral bodies for development applications, but also the public. So the public who are impacted by the externalities of development, thinking about how community activist groups have platforms to be involved in that process. It's not just those in neighboring properties who are impacted by development. So there's a lot of things around that ecological, social, financial responsibility for future generations that we want to think about here too. And of course, AI augmentation introduces a fifth actor group, which are tool developers and technologists, whether they're internal to organizations or external to organizations, developers of tools. And we're starting to see these tools come on the market and into our planning systems. And I'll provide a bit of a stock take a few slides down the track. But before I do that, I just want to unpack trust. So trust can be understood in lots of different ways from lots of different starting points. And our starting point is really focused on planning. So we're looking at planning and the planning process and thinking about stakeholder trust and actor trust in that process. Trust is critical for planning processes and outcomes, that those processes are trusted, that those outcomes are accepted. In planning theory, there's been the identification of a long-standing crisis of trust or a trust deficit, which goes back to, I guess, old school, or not, it's only 25 years old now, but Putnam's work on that declining trust in authority and coming from community. What does that look like when institutional trust is lost? And this was picked up in really interesting ways in sort of the mid-2000s around planning theory, where there was a lot of focus on trust and trustworthiness of institutions, but also interpersonally. The actors involved in planning and the planning process, what are the underlying reasons to trust each other? How do people see each other's motivations? Of course, for planning, it's always been an issue. While planning outcomes are purportedly grounded in the public good and public interest, there are multiple publics with multiple interests, particularly where development's concerned. And as a result, development assessment, so land use planning, outcomes are often contentious. It's not a stretch to think about a development in your local community. Think about the developers who are trying to get something done and coming up against the local planning authorities to get that development the way they want it. The level of trust that's displayed between those two groups, that could be from long-standing relationships, it could be from lots of different things. But thinking as well about the increasing interest and engagement of community and community activist groups, particularly whether pro or anti-development, that we're seeing come to the fore in housing planning debates. There are things here that are already here, existing trust issues around a contentious process that we really want to dive into, and is sort of the conceptual starting point for this project. Of course, that brings in thoughts around post-political planning and the politics and power in development assessment processes, where there are things being done in the public interest. We can't discredit bad faith actors in the planning sector. So there's a lot going on here. Trust in planning, expertise, accountability, and transparency. But of course, AI brings its own planning issues. It's got its own concerns around trust and public trust, and I guess perceptions of what AI is and how it operates and its impact environmentally, socially, financially on the world. And there's some work already starting to emerge here around AI and how it's reshaping urban planning. So we're on the crest of a wave here. There's a lot of research in this space. I don't think I've ever been on a project before where the pace of a literature review has ever been as fast. I'm sure other folks in this area would tend to agree. So here, a piece recently published in Nature by Li and Dang that by reducing the role of planners in negotiating complex stakeholder interests and obscuring responsibility for outcomes, which is one pathway for AI adoption, that it overtakes the role of the planner in the process, subsumes that role, that AI threatens to erode public trust and professional legitimacy. So by bolting on a technology that already has its own trust issues into a contentious process, where stakeholders and actors in that process may already have pretty low levels of trust, whether that's mistrust or distrust that people are not, performing their abilities as they should. So we've been looking at ways to think about trust and locate trust in planning, and we've started with, I guess, approaching trust in planning at 3 different scales. So firstly, thinking about governance at the top, planning systems and how they operate. Secondly, thinking about planning actors, so the relationships between actors and how they play out. And then lastly, thinking about planning tasks. So what it looks like for planners who are tasked with this work, what those processes look like, and the level of trust that folks have in those processes. But of course, if we add AI to that process, not only does AI impact the planning system, but it also impacts at each of those scales. And it's something that I'll unpack in the next few slides. But we're starting with these existing trust issues in planning that we're locating at different scales, and the trust issues that emerge from AI augmentation, but also there's an interface with planning and trust and AI at all of these scales that we're starting to unpack in conceptual work. So to just go through each of these in turn, if we think about planning systems and trust, one of the things that has sort of emerged from the neoliberalization of government is this focus on technocracy, technocratic governance, that there's an idea that cities can be planned using data and analytics, that cities are machines that can be programmed and functioned for operational efficiencies. And of course, some of that is true. But the ideology that sits behind that is extended to a point of AI urbanism. And here we look at research that's been established over the last sort of 10 to 15 years in critical urban studies focused on smart urbanism. So it's not too long that we were all sitting and thinking about smart cities and what that meant for the world, as a very strong movement of policy focus around smart cities and how to integrate technology for operational efficiencies, but also to mark and claim cities as places of innovation and tech investment. The AI urbanism here is a little bit different. It's seen as a distinct shift in how the city is shaped by technology. Some leading work by Sugarulo and co-authors sort of put a flag in the ground in this area and thought about ways that smart and AI urbanism differed from each other. And some of those things are really around automation and augmentation that are intrinsic to AI as a technology. That in terms of agency, for smart urbanism, it might have been the automation of bins that had sensors and could tell city officials and municipal folks when those bins were full, and then they could go and be collected. But here there's autonomy. You can get AI agents to work on their own with a workflow, and there's operational challenges and really interesting things that are worth attention for urban studies. Within the framework of AI urbanism, we're identifying these tools that are being augmented into development assessment processes as urban software agents. And there's persistent questions for those tools, building on the work that's been done in smart urbanism and platform urbanism. Firstly, around the importance of government agendas and initiatives here. So government support to get things started, to show attention and energy, and also put in many cases some capital behind the integration of these ideas and these ideologies into practice. Also thinking, of course, about technology firms and their role here, where firms are thinking about, this is McNeil's work, thinking about IBM and the role of smart cities, that technology firms were steering problem framing to something that their products can solve. So there's a lot of work here around technologists and what they're doing that we need to be mindful of. And then lastly, of course, it's how these ideas are translated on the ground. So actually existing forms of AI urbanism, what do these ideas, these ideologies look like when in a local government or for a specific planning application? This is some of the stuff that we're starting to sort of dig into in this project. Secondly, planning actors and trust. So here we're thinking, I guess, around critical planning theory and urban studies. There's a lot of work here and a lot of factors, but I guess this slide's sort of showing some of the things that we're starting to contend with and will become a focus of our work. As I said earlier, there's underlying trust issues, trust deficit sources between actors in this process, between government layers, whether it's local and state government, between councils and developers, and vice versa, between developers and community, between government and community. And these assumptions shape expectations, and they're also going to impact the adoption of technology. So there's a lot here to unpack, but thinking particularly, I suppose something that's really found purchase in this space is citizen participation. So what does citizen participation look like using AI, filtered by AI, with AI, whether that's at the extreme end, AI being used to generate personas for community and simulating community engagement, which is we've seen these things being tested. But even just simply thinking about a planning official that receives 1,000 community engagement submissions and uses an AI agent or an LLM to summarize those and summarize that community engagement. So what are we gaining and what are we losing, particularly from a citizen perspective, a community perspective, with the integration of AI? There are opportunities, of course, through digital participation that it will increase citizenship. But there's a lot of, I suppose, caution. And I guess a pretty provocative editorial in Planning Theory and Practice towards the end of 2024 was by Lisa Bates, that a computer must never make a planning decision. And really trying to assert the authority, the legitimacy, the expertise of planners in this space, that there's caution here that needs to be displayed before things start to roll. And then lastly, planning tasks and trust. So here we're drawing on planning support science. There's a long-standing history of tech development and implementation in planning, whether we go back to geographic information systems, but work that's been done on urban modeling, digital twins, visualization, some of the things that folks at City Futures have been working on for a very long time. But despite some of those big tech inroads, there is slow adoption that is cited by planners, and resistance to that adoption, or making that adoption more straightforward or more enticing, is something that we're really interested here too. And thinking about AI and its ubiquity, its capacities, and I guess a chain of logic that people are using it in their private lives, so maybe they can use it in their work lives a little bit more easier. Maybe AI can be something that can bridge that implementation gap. Is there a better fit? Is there enhanced user acceptance? And this is work that I've profiled on this slide here. There's a complex history with the embrace of technology in planning, and that's something that starts as a base layer for AI. And then lastly, of course, just to canvas quickly, AI has its own baggage related to trust. And since the public release of ChatGPT in November 2022, there has been significant uptake and financial investment in tech development. But high-profile failures in automated decision-making, be that, I guess, a great example in Australia, well, a horrible example, not a great example, being the robo-debt scandal in Australia. So, how does automated decision-making failures impact public perception and henceforth trust? There's a black box on the slide for a reason, because the black box nature of this technology, of machine learning and large language models, for good reasons sometimes, whether it's to protect proprietary tech and algorithms and data security, and other really critical things. It does have issues for transparency, of explainability, and these are things that are critical to this concept of trust, which is well established in AI ethics, trustworthy AI. So the way that we're bringing this idea, the shape of this idea into the project, is through one of the earliest definitions of trustworthy AI in policy, being the European Commission's high-level expert group on AI ethics guidelines for trustworthy AI, which was released in 2019. These are voluntary guidelines only, but it is designed as a framework to step through a life cycle of an AI tool. And we wanted to use this as an established term, as a framework, and look at these three components and how they might apply to the development assessment process and planning more broadly. So thinking about lawful, ethical, and robust components of an AI tool, all of which are critical in a statutory context, such as planning. So really here, we're sort of trying to push back against trustworthiness becoming an empty signifier in AI, similar to things about greenwashing or sports washing or other terms. We want to make sure that if trustworthy AI is something that's being put forward, that there is trust in trustworthiness. And that's something that we want to contribute to across the life of this project. So before I dive into what we've done, I just want to do a very quick stock take of AI for development assessment in 2026. Of course, there are other things that we probably haven't captured, and very happy to hear more in the comments afterwards. So to just quickly look at development assessment and simplify it into 7 stages. This is a statutory process, of course, for land use. In Australia, planning is a state responsibility, so different jurisdictions have different processes, similar processes, but different. They have similar but different terms for development assessment. So for folks in Victoria, about planning permits and planning permission, for example. And internationally, this assessment process operates differently on a spectrum, whether that's from compliance development, which I guess you could simplify as like a tick and flick, yes, no, sort of deemed to comply, to merit-based assessment, so impact assessment, a detailed, maybe more qualitative look at a planning application and its merits and its benefits. Australia's land use system has components of both, being, I guess, sort of grounded in both the UK and US land use planning processes. Looking at all of these stages, AI technologies will be integrated across all of these steps and will impact different actor groups across this. So it's a bit of a watch this space, but we are trying to, not only is AI a black box, but development assessment and the planning process, and planning as a staged approach is something that we really want to contribute to the space as well. So what does AI in development assessment in Australia look like in early 2026? I want to talk to 3 things. So firstly, we're seeing a rapidly maturing group of purpose-built solutions that use a form of AI technology in some capacity to support statutory planning tasks and functions. I'm going to bounce a few that folks may be familiar with on this slide. So ArchiStar, MyLot, Objective, Rico, PropCode, and Daisy, which is a tool that has been run in several councils in New South Wales. The implementation of Daisy for Cumberland won a PO award last year for planning excellence. So, these things are being adopted and brought forward. in different ways, but I guess there are common ways where we're seeing that technological capacity. Firstly, it's around planning inquiry support for proponents. So at that pre-submission stage, where advice is provided with disclaimers that AI can get things wrong, and that talking to planners is still part of it should be an essential part of your due diligence. Other things that AI is being used to help with in this sort of early phase: application completeness checker prior to lodgement, so making sure you've got everything you need to sort of, I guess, stop that cycling of revisions or further information requests that can be part of the process slowing down. And tasks beyond that pre-lodgement stage are really limited at this stage, and there's good reason for that. But it is advancing fast, and we are starting to see some of these tools move into different spaces with more robust, I suppose, decision support focuses. So it could be around a pre-assessment check to make sure that things are coming together once the application has been submitted. And sort of doing some of that work that a duty planner or an early career planner would be doing, compiling evidence, putting things together, so that that the planner who ends up signing off on those things has all the information they need. Also, really interesting to see other interest groups getting purpose-built tools for parts of this process. So there are a couple of tools coming out of the UK in particular that are including support for objections. So there's a tool called Objector, where you can upload a planning application and you can generate objections to that based on statutory and strategic planning grounds, which again makes us think a bit about that process of community engagement and what it may look like in the future. The other thing too that sort of sits beside these tools developing and stepping forward, scaling up and out, is things that the government are doing to support AI adoption and I suppose increase capacity in planning. So we're seeing piecemeal uptake of these tools and solutions by councils and private planners across Australia, partly being driven through pilots and grants. So New South Wales, on the screen here, I've just got the AI Solutions Panel that was established in mid-2024, alongside an early adopter scheme grant, which was offered to local councils in New South Wales, of which there were 14 successful applications and 4 suppliers on that panel. So that ran from mid-2024 and is still underway at the moment. In Victoria, we saw 2 rounds of digital planning grants across the financial years 2022-23 and 23-24. And the federal government's housing support program grants, that first stream for improving planning capability that was announced in July 2024, approximately a dozen of those were using AI technologies in some way to support planning capabilities. So, quite interesting to see how those pilots and grants have been crucial to the story that we're starting to see unfold. As those solutions start to mature, implementation is underway agnostic of grant funding. So we're starting to see some of those developers gain clients without the help of grants and pilots, which shows the maturity of the market at the moment. But of course, call it shadow AI adoption or ubiquitous AI, it's no doubt underway across the profession, across all stages of the planning process in development assessment and across those actors. So using Copilot, ChatGPT and such to help make these things a little bit clearer. We're also seeing, of course, a growing corpus of specific advice and leadership for planners, specifically regarding AI use. So this began, I suppose, with PIA's American equivalent, a white paper, Opportunities and Challenges and How to Prepare in 2022. But PIA have really been on the front foot in the last 12 months or so, thinking about what AI in planning means for planners on the ground. And I suppose this represents a growing recognition that even if the technologies stop developing today, these technologies will have profound and lasting impacts on planning tasks and functions. So here we're thinking about a step change. We're trying to frame these as opportunities rather than threats. I will just point out here work done by the Municipal Associations of Victoria, which was funded by one of those federal housing support program grants, is sort of an excellent snapshot of what's happening in Victoria at the moment, and the adoption that's underway. So yeah, I encourage you to check it out. With the time that I've got left, probably got about 10 minutes or so to talk through what we've been doing in an early stage of fieldwork. So primarily, we're looking at this qualitatively in terms of data and ways to capture development, implementation, and use. Our focus at this point is on early adoption, and that is characterized, as I said earlier, by pilots and grants. So that early focus has really been about that, I suppose, climate of experimentation. What's happening between these groups that we've identified that are crucial to the development assessment process, and what can we capture in this first moment? Because the first piece of uptake is critical to that uptake continuing. It's critical to trust, and that ongoing trust in process and outcomes. If something goes wrong now, if things are there's complexities that can be added at this stage that we want to try and capture for the pathway forward. So at this stage, we've done approximately 30 interviews across these groups, over half of which have looked at local government, so as adopters and end users. Our interviews are focused on 4 broad themes, really focused on those 2 things, so the tech and the statutory process and the reforms that have been underway in planning. So the current state of statutory planning, how AI impacts on that, considerations for trustworthy adoption, but then also thinking towards the future. So what does the future of AI and urban planning look like? What skills, capacities, and considerations are required for us to think about now? I'm going to talk just really about pilots here, so as critical building blocks for trust, as I've just mentioned, and also thinking about just those interactions between tool developers and technologists and local government. So 2 very different knowledge domains, sources of expertise, very different operating environments and risk appetites and registers of time. So timeliness around how things are done and when things need to be done. So how do we build trust through experimentation? I'm going to sort of point to 3 early themes. Then I'll jump to some key findings at this stage and open up for the discussion. So firstly, expectations, hopes, and hype. Secondly, collaboration and understanding. And lastly, adoption and confidence. So just at a high level, early doors in this process, there was, as I mentioned earlier, this peak of inflated expectations that AI could come in and solve multiple problems fast. There were assumed use cases, and they were labeled and outlined in grant programs. So that focus on pre-assessment was deliberate, partly because it was seen as, I suppose, low-hanging fruit, that it could be something, getting that application as correct as it can be, as complete as it can be, is one way to save time. And poor quality applications being identified as one of the blockers in the process. So just a couple of quotes here, thinking about what expectations were like at the beginning of a pilot. From one council: if we can free up our planners' time to focus on DA assessments, we can also just get more DA assessments done. So there's this reiteration of that productivity narrative that there can be more done with this technology augmenting the process and tasks involved. But then also thinking about, and something that to take forward and maybe to talk about in the discussion is, if we are going to free up, as the second quote says on this slide, if we're going to free up time to talk to people and bring back the human element into planning, what does that look like? What could it look like? And instead of doing, editing and checking for documents and names and such, things that can be automated easily, what else could be possible? What else could be added to the process potentially? Secondly, on collaboration and understanding, it's no surprise that there was upskilling and literacy required on both sides. Both processes are complex. A lot of the local councils that we've spoken with so far really labored the point that that outsiders coming into a process and understanding how development assessment works were surprised by the complexity of that process, and staff labor and time for training, for checking tools, for doing some of that that iterative work that helps large language models perform better, that were part of the pilots and grants. Um, so, a quote above here, let's be honest, it created more work. Not only are they answering, like doing their jobs as duty planners or early career planners, they're now having to do daily checks on AI questions that are supposed to decrease our public interface. So, early doors with thinking about, there's going to be, you're going to walk before you can run, I suppose, but there's a lot of work that's being done by these organizations at this early stage to lay the path forward. But also thinking about the human element in that process too, and the experience that planners have, particularly around things like merit-based assessment. There's a lot of potential for codified assessment here, where there's Boolean logic around yes or no, does this comply, does it not? But once you get into the gray and get into those other ways of looking at development and its impacts and outcomes, there's still, of course, a lot of room for human planning. And what stance folks have on that now, and I guess the pace that technology is moving at, there's a lot of concern, and levels of understanding between two parties is part of that process, having empathy for both sides. Of course, it also shows that when you add something to a process, you start to look at that process in its deficiencies already and where things may be inefficient. And of course, it'll be no news to folks on the call that are used to working in this space that planning data completeness, underlying systems being ready for AI. There's a lot of work to be done on the ground and in those sort of information architectures of councils and other organizations to make sure that we can reap the most and the most the most beneficial things out of this adoption stage. And then lastly, adoption and confidence. At this stage, when you're piloting and working with proof of concepts and tools that are being built, you're building the plane while flying it. You're working with councils to understand their processes and bring along their planning tools and documents into one place. There's a lot of fragmentation in that and individualization across and between different local councils. So it's a lot of work for tool developers to come on and try and perhaps standardize this kind of work. But first and foremost, the integrity of the answer is critical. So this quote, the moment it gives inaccurate information, you've lost your trust, you will lose that person. You earn trust in teaspoons and you lose it in spades. And for local governments, there is legal recourse for these things going wrong. So taking planning decisions to appealing authorities, to courts. So there are different risk appetites here, and accuracy is critical. But of course, in a pilot and grant context, you're not going to get 100% accuracy all the time. So this is where having empathy for both sides is critical to that collaboration. And then lastly, thinking about this as a new space that's growing and maturing, and people are dipping into this space in different ways. Just reflections that there are valuable learnings here, despite the fact that there may have been things that weren't ideal, that expectations were not met in the initial sense, that things took longer than people expected. One council staff member here, future instances will be implementation of the thing that we went through. It was a fun process. The trust building is going to be greater for us because we were one of the first adopters of this solution. So just recognition that experimenting and being open to experimentation is something that is being touted in this space. That it's something that I think these sort of early lessons and early wins are part of that expectation around what might be next. So with the time I've got left, I'm just going to run through a couple of key takeaways. So in lots of ways we've been here before, thinking about technocratic governance and bringing technology into processes and reforming processes using technology. So we're trying to think, what's different about this moment, if anything? What can we learn during this change management process? At this stage, building trust for and with AI in this space is a product of the pilot experience. It's critical to what might be next. Good and productive experiences of working together, of working with the technology and developing it and seeing how it fits use cases and how end users respond to it, how expectations meet reality, and then how those expectations can be shared with others so that reality might be a little bit closer. It's really critical in this space. Second, effective collaboration. So, here thinking about ways to bridge upskilling and literacy, there are individuals that possess both sides of that of the coin, whether that's understanding the technology, being upskilled on urban analytics, and then going into a planning planning consultancy or a local council. There are people that are on both sides of that, but at the point that these two groups need to come together and think about what could be the best way forward. And then, of course, lastly, and critically for thinking forward, that fundamentally trust comes from accuracy, reflecting user and task requirements and the risk environment. So we're looking at the pilot space, we're looking at seed funding. How do we build on that? From a government perspective, maybe one seed blooms and that's fantastic. But if we think about smart cities and the legacy that the smart cities movement had in Australia around cycles of grants and pilots and councils and smart city strategies and people who were employed as smart cities officers, 10 years down the track, that's pretty slim on the ground from where it was in 2016. I'm just going to finish on this quote. So thinking about systems and processes and introducing something new. So this is a piece of work that was done around smart city adoption in the UK. And I think it speaks really nicely to what we're sort of seeing here. That these urban experiments, these pilots, these grants, they're ephemeral. They may be structurally insignificant to some. They may appear that way, but this peripherality and dynamic flexibility enables them to pose challenge to established ways of working. So before we tackle new trust issues, let's consider the existing trust issues. Before we think about AI augmented planning, let's think about the planning process already. What can we take forward from this moment? We're in the tides of rapid change here, but maybe what do we leave behind? There's parts of this process that maybe we could start to rethink, or at the very least, give a level of citizen engagement or trust or different kinds of authority to the situation. So just to finish with what's next, because we're at the end of year one, we've been really focused on the Australian context and the use of AI. It's about to wrap up that focus on the early adoption in Australia. But then we're going to look at international cases of planning reform using AI. Next, we'll be doing future scenario workshops with planning and industry stakeholders. And then lastly, thinking about the core objective of the project, refining the conceptual framework that we're working on and feeding that back to people who are on the tools, to the end users and to industry. So thanks very much for your time. And yeah, look forward to the discussion. And given this space is fast moving, I'm very interested to hear from the audience online about, what might be happening for them and, maybe things that maybe we should be keeping an eye out for as we move into 2026. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Charlie. Yeah, really informative presentation. And as you say, a very fast moving space. So we have about a bit under 10 minutes for some questions. So you're very welcome to use the chat function or pop your hand up and we can go to you and unmute you. Great, Leo.
Hi, it's Leo. Thanks so much, Charlie, for sharing your insights. Unfortunately, my attention to your lecture was interrupted by a drop-in meeting, but I hear most of it. I share your caution and optimism in the AI space. Both of the caution and the optimism are really real
Yes.
and great to see people feeling the same as well. So a bit of background, I research in AI in urbanism, but I'm more on the technical side in this spectrum. I see you are probably more towards the policy framework, and that's really good complement to my own perspectives. And what I feel here, just to take your last few slides, when you talk about the smart cities and its how that may compare with the AI hype, I think it does have some similarity where it's all kind of slightly funded by government, by the seed fundings and research budget. But I do feel this time is different, where we do see a lot of productivity powers being unleashed from AI, and I don't see this trend is going any slower. And my question then become, and you probably in the middle of your presentation, you do have presented quite a few different startups that just emerged. Some of them being around for a very long time already, but had a sudden direction change. Some of them has been there for just probably a few months, and some of them I never heard about them. So and I think this is only going to accelerate given by how fast people can develop based on AI. And I feel one more risk is probably towards what are the risks that everyone has the same amount of information but biased in their own echo chamber. But just coming back to it, when you see so many different startups coming up, what would be your opinion or your action towards how do you want to research them and how do you want to systematically collect them in your framework?
Yeah, thank you. It's a really good question, and it's something that's not lost on us. I mean, given how quickly this space is moving, the fact that we've got 3 years might seem like a luxury, but it's actually really challenging because it's not like you can take a snapshot of the last 3 months and say, that's where we're up to. We've got 3 years of technology development to contend with. So at this stage, we were really looking at things that were, I guess, higher profile. We know that there are, I'm sure, individuals in their bedrooms making these tools that have similar functionalities and capabilities and bringing them into councils. They may be employees of councils and of planning consultancies, and they're starting to scale these things up. So my short answer is it's going to be really hard if we're trying to have a really comprehensive ecosystem of what's going on. But I think at this stage, we're looking at those higher profile adopted solutions. Of course, some will come online as we go. Some will be different, some will be similar. So we'll be sort of, I guess, looking at maybe building a little bit of a typology around what different tools are doing. And if we've captured some of those typologies, there'll be others that will come online that are of interest too. So it's a challenge is the short answer. But yeah, thanks very much.
And thank you, Charlie. Just one more thing. I'd like to just bring back to the center concept trust here. I think it's probably a very good theme to investigate as new emerging unknown things are coming. And I think transparency and trust will be a very important factor to play as well. Thank you.
Yeah, very much. Thank you.
Thank you. We have a reflection in the chat box.
That
was echoing for everyone. We're going to jump to the room at UNSW in a minute, but just whether you wanted to add any reflection to the comment in the chat, Charlie, from Chris Johnson in relation to the pattern books.
Yeah, thank you, Chris. I can see your comment. Exactly. I mean, that's sort of the codified Boolean logic, yes, no, where code accessibility or deemed to comply development. There are very quick potential to make decisions faster there. So it's certainly something that is within the scope of our project. South Australia as well, they're deemed to comply legislation is something that we're really interested in thinking about. That where there are really clear yes no answers, that sort of early potential is quite clear and quite compelling.
Thank you. And we'll try and go to the question in the lab.
I'm going to try to give this a go. Can you hear us?
Yes. Thanks, Andy.
Hi, Charlie. Thank you so much for that presentation. And the thing I was curious about when you were talking is with the interviews that you've had, kind of looking aside from the accuracy aspect of kind of creating that trust, do they have specific programs or training sessions? How do they kind of help staff develop trust, where there is kind of technology skepticism?
Yeah. Thank you, Andy. I mean, it's a lot of it is about time. It's about investing time in working with staff. So a lot of, I guess, different forms of co-design have been mentioned by tool developers using human-centered design approaches to understand a problem. That sort of double diamond approach that you start broad, understand a problem, refine that problem, then go out to find a solution and come back. So there's a lot of different logics here, but time is sort of key in that, spending time understanding problems, doing shadowing. It's sort of that kind of work that is helping bring people together on, I suppose, on a journey.
And did the interviews feel that they had been given that time? So the developers of the software kind of co-developed that, have processes in place, but the end users, who might be the consumers, they felt that they had given this time?
I mean, as I said before, the local councils were, they brought people into the journey, and the tool developers were surprised by the complexity of that process. But in the main, I think that people took away lessons from the approach, whether that was let's not go down this pathway again, or whether it was, we learned something here. But I think at this early stage, there just needs to be that focused attention from both parties in being involved in this process, which is tricky because you're being limited by grant funding deadlines and pilot specifications and use cases and things like that. So I guess there's sort of limitations to how far you can go at this stage, where there's boxes around timing and the scope of tools and things like that. So I guess we're sort of going to see, stepped improvement that will come from capacity building through pilots and grants. But of course, tool developers will be working in the background doing other things. Councils are building up capability and expertise. And we're starting to see, some of the folks that have been involved in these early stages of development sort of stepping forward as champions of this process. So, recent PIA state conferences, National Congress, other meetings of planners, we're starting to get folks speak about their experiences of this. And in the main, they're positive. So it's the amount of work is not lost on them. But yeah, these are positive experiences at this stage. I think just back to that point that even if AI stopped developing today, it's going to change processes and tasks and functions, not just in planning, but in all of our jobs on the call today. And what can we do best with that situation now and get in front of it? So that's, I suppose, what we're really interested in seeing over the next couple of years of the project. Thanks, Andy.
Thank you.
Well, that brings us to the end of the time that we have. Thank you so much, Charlie, and this is going to be a really interesting project to watch over the next couple of years, and we'll look forward to you reporting back to the series. So thank you everyone for joining us today. Our next seminar will be held in 2 weeks on the 19th, and we look forward to hearing from Professor John Landis, who's visiting from the University of Pennsylvania, presenting Big Cities, Bold Moves, Good Outcomes, a success manual for global cities. And following our seminar on the 19th, we invite those that are joining us in person to stay for light refreshments and networking from 5 to 6 p.m. And if you'd like to join us in person, please RSVP by the 12th of February for catering purposes. So thanks very much and have a great evening.
Cool. Thanks for sharing, Sophie, mate.